June, hello, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, we'll start by asking you the question we kick off every discussion with, and that is what's the wrong you want to right?
Love it. Good question and a big one. But I'd say something that's always top of mind for me is how can I um, change that feeling that tech is a boys' club and there is no space for women and girls, and also redefining that thinking that female founders and founders of color cannot raise big rounds of investment.
That's really interesting, and you've had quite a varied career up until this point. When did this problem first sort of crystallize for you and as something which you actually wanted to actively try and tackle?
So the first time that I realized that perhaps I had a bit of a calling in the world. I think, prior to my second maternity leave, I was just a regular girl doing her work at SVB, just kind of getting on with things, never realizing that I was sort of meant to have any sort of dent in the universe and change anything, and be sort of like an activist. But I realized sort of in that 2 month period after having my second child, it had a cesarean and I had loads of time to think. And I realized that, I'd gone back to work the first time around with really low confidence, and I wanted to do something different. I wanted to stay learning, and obviously working with loads of tech companies, I realized that there was a big gap in me being able to ask those technical questions. So in wanting to learn about code and wanting to try and build something, I realized that there was a gap in the market and nothing existed for, first of all, for mothers to learn and upskill, let alone in the world of tech. A lot of the coding boot camps were either really expensive or the meetups were in the evenings. So no one had really factored us in. So I really wanted to demystify that thinking that actually, women want to learn to code. And I put out a what's it called, like a mail. I think it was a Mailchimp request, and people signed up to my mailing list saying that they wanted to learn to code. I think I got about 100 people come back to me in 2 weeks, and it started from there. I decided I was going to create this coding school for moms. I gave myself 4 months. It was a mammoth project, given I wanted to be the student, and I suddenly found myself building this coding school. But it was an eye opener. It made me realize just how many women want to get into this industry are, under the impression that it's a boys' club, that there's no room for them, that coding is, or technology actually is just being in this dark room coding away. But actually, my intention was to really open up that world to them and help them realize that, working in a tech company is so collaborative. There's so many different roles, all of which are equally important: product, UX, the software side of things. So really demystifying tech and showing them that there's a place for them. Luckily, it's on the national curriculum, so there's even more of an incentive to learn, so that you can help your kids with their homework. And it's been really important. And I think in that journey of running Mums in Tech for 3 years, I met so many incredible women, so many incredible female founders, which really was when that other side became activated, and me really realizing just how stark the numbers were. Not many women were getting the investment they deserved, which in itself is awful, to think that you walk into a room and instantly you're underestimated. Founders of color are constantly underestimated. And I think that that needs to change. And that's something that I'm constantly advocating for in all I do, whether it's through the education piece and spending time mentoring. And there is this thing that founders, especially female founders and founders of color, are over mentored and underfunded. So I really want to see that change. And, I think it's important to highlight those role models, those who've been lucky to raise those bigger rounds, showing that it can be done, to, you know, advocate for unconscious bias training, because I think the reality is, as investors, we're guilty of pattern matching. It's how it's always been done. It's the easy way out, I think. And I think the more we vocalize just how big of a problem it is, I think this needs to be constantly at the forefront of everyone when you get your deal flow, when you're looking at your weekly list of companies you've seen. Have you seen a representative proportion of the population, like, or are you just looking at guys who've gone to Cambridge and Oxford and have, been through the investment banks? There's a, you know, it's so important that we allow, and I say allow intentionally, because these products need to get to market, but products that are created by people who are representative of society. Otherwise, we have this unconscious bias continuously filtering through in the products that we end up using, because they've not been created by people who are representative of our the real world. So I think that's really what spurs me on. I want to see a fairer, equal society, and I think it's important that everyone feels that way. But that's my hope.
No, and
Long
there's
answer.
no, that's really good, and there's quite a few things that I kind of want to dive into. I guess just going back to mums in technology to begin with. When you first started meeting the women who wanted to take part in the course and learn to code, what was their perception of that boys club idea? Did they have that's well, part stereotype, but very much a real truth as well in their minds, that was a blocker, or was for some of them, I guess it was just a complete unknown what this involved?
Yeah, it was a mixed bag. Some of them had worked in tech companies, just maybe on the product side, or some worked in agile and just wanted, project management, didn't really understand what the techies did,
Mm.
just because that was never really broken down to them. Everyone just sort of got on with their jobs and worked in silos. Um, and I guess that you feel a bit intimidated if you don't see people that look like you on the other side. So perhaps in a lot of those companies, there were no women on the technical teams. So therefore, they didn't feel that there was a place for them. And I think this is why I advocate for representation, because in everything we do, because if you don't see someone that looks like you, a lot of times perhaps you don't see yourself in those roles and in those industries. There was 17, this still is, which is really sad, 17% of women in tech. It's abysmal, it's tiny. And it goes back to, when you're at school, many women that I came across were interested in these subjects, but were told by teachers that they should be pursuing the arts, because it was more suited to them. And I think the boys are then pushed to the sciences, which is why I love, groups like STEMETS and Kajigo, which is the app that I mentor, who are advocating for these sort of grassroots programs going into schools early, the point where the girls are likely to be making that decision as to whether to pursue something in the sciences or the arts, and just helping them realize that you can do it. There's
Mm.
amazing women who have built amazing things. Dame Stephanie, I think she's one of those role models who I think everyone should learn about, and all the great work she's done. Anne Marie Maffedon. There's so many great women who need to be highlighted, and for these little girls to see and realize that there's space for them.
That's interesting. So, like, to some extent, we're still trying to unpick the sort of divisions of those really old school ideas of what girls study at school and what boys should
Yeah,
study at school.
it's awful. It's really awful. It shouldn't be like that. Everyone can learn anything. And this is something that I truly believe. When you're curious, you can learn anything. I don't believe that there are certain subjects for girls and boys.
Are your own children getting interested in technology and coding and?
They have no choice. I'm their mother. But you know what? Because Ivy, she's the mums in tech baby. I called her my co-founder. She was there from 2 months. She was, going across town with me to hanging out with, founders and coders, hanging out with Catherine Parsons at Decoded, going to Code First Girls. She was everywhere. She's immersed in technology. But I think more importantly, she realized that mommy can do this. I can do anything. And she's, every week we get Tech Will Save Us kits, and she builds stuff with her brother. She's really curious. And I love that he sees that she's interested and they're building together. And I think this is so important that, you know, boys are also shown that girls can do these great things, so that they grow up as, ambassadors and advocates for equality. This is what we want to see, because I think if they have that perception that a girl can do anything, then wow, we're really moving the needle.
No, really interesting. And I guess I'm just reflecting on this idea of a boys' club as well, and obviously very evident in technology. I guess does this also cross over to your experience in finance, which in many aspects it could be labeled with the same thing.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why we celebrate every time we see a female partner being announced. I think just in the last 2 or 3 months, we've seen about four more women rise to partner level at some of these large funds. And it's so important because representation at the table, diversity of thought, I think that is the key. And this is something I always say, it's not just about having different colors, different genders, diversity of thought. People bring different perspectives, and it's so important to avoid groupthink, but it has to be so conscious, and it absolutely should be meritocratic. Sometimes we see those headlines we don't like, saying a woman's been pushed to the top because of diversity. No, she worked hard. That's why she's at the top. And I think women need to realize that they absolutely have a seat at the table. They deserve it. We put in the work. You deserve to get to the top, and I think no one should sort of reframe it as it's a diversity agenda. But having more representation is important. I think it will help. First of all, female founders to have a sense that, okay, there's someone really rooting for me. And the reality is there's certain issues where it's important to have a woman. If we're talking about a menopause product, femtech is so important, underserved market. And I think now it's really coming to the forefront. I would say partly because we're seeing more female partners, because these discussions need to happen. They're uncomfortable because a man may not necessarily empathize as much, not because he doesn't want to, but he hasn't been through it. But having someone at the top who can really make sure these discussions are heard and really hold that conversation, and give it gravitas, I think is important. And that's how we ensure that these companies get funded, because they need to be funded, because these are real problems that are happening, and there's just no great solutions for women who are going through menopause.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess one of the harshest criticisms of the sort of VC and startup world could be that often it's a lot of wealthy white people solving problems of other wealthy white people, and
Yeah,
often men in that mix as well as an
absolutely.
overarching thing. But yeah, as you say, it's almost like you have to change those inputs of the stimulus and of the problems which are on the table to be discussed.
Exactly. Exactly.
There was something you mentioned earlier about female founders and founders of color being over mentored but underfunded. Can you explain a bit more about what that means and how that plays out?
Well, in essence, there's just, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of talk. People are offering, which is great, and I think there is, that there is 100% an education piece that needs to happen to make sure that people are pitch ready when they come in the room. But ultimately, we want to see pounds going into those companies, dollars going into those companies, and allowing them to have that firepower to really give it a good shot. Because I think at the end of the day, that's what they need. That's what's going to allow them to hire the best talent, allow them to really have that firepower and make it a real business. Talking and talking and talking about the same issue. This is how we feel about the problem of women in tech and girls in tech. Put money behind it. Make sure that you're funding coding education to go into schools, allowing them to have these programs that will stimulate that curiosity and help them stay on track and want to pursue these careers. Making sure that there's jobs actually available for them to do when they do go on these programs, go to these coding boot camps, hire them, and then you have this cycle, because then they realize that actually it's paying off. The same with founders of color and female founders. If they're pitching, fund them. If they're great businesses, don't just say, "Oh, you need more mentoring, you need more time." Put the money behind what you're saying.
Hmm. And is part of this a sort of symptom of how these type of companies have to market themselves and grow their brands now is almost there's this expectation of a founder having a big personal brand and being a big character and putting themselves out there, being the very visible CEO, and the sort of the quieter character who maybe doesn't want all the attention on themselves might face a much bigger challenge, as you say, when they get to the pitch, and maybe the
Yeah.
VCs around the table are like, oh, I haven't heard too much about you. Like it doesn't seem like you're competing against the other people in your space. It's a yeah. How much does that play into it in your mind?
So I would say that is a big problem. And it goes back to the pattern matching, because you're comparing them to people who have had certain experiences because they've been to certain schools and they've been surrounded by certain people. So they're more confident, they're more certain that actually, if it goes all bad, perhaps I come from a bit of privilege. So I can still, carry on building because I don't have to worry about finances. I don't have to worry about any dependence. And I think this is where it goes back to that socioeconomic background as well, playing a big role in how people have to just survive. I mean, the reality is, when we talk about things like friends and family rounds, not everyone has access to friends with millions of pounds who can give you a couple 100,000, to start, seed your business. So I think those sorts of things come into play when you're sitting in front of an investor. This is the first conversation you've ever had about funding. You've not necessarily been on an accelerator. You don't necessarily speak in the same way that they're expecting you to speak. And I think it's up to us as investors to check ourselves and say, okay, well, is that what really counts? How they speak, how they come dressed, or like where they went to school, or are they solving an important problem? Have they got the curiosity, the acumen to actually deliver on it? Can they attract talent? And is this problem worth solving? Is this worth putting money behind? So I think it has to be very intentional on the part of investors, but also on the part of the founder to come into that room owning it, owning your experience, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a different experience. We're not all meant to be homogenous. And I think coming in and showing how your experience is actually relevant to you building this particular business. Someone like me who has afro hair, and if I were to be starting a hair business, I think I got experience because I'm the end user. Been through it. I felt that pain point of trying to buy hair and trying to do all this stuff. And I think that is so important that people own their journey. And I think, um, don't try and fit into a certain box that you feel that investors want you to fit. You'll be wasting your time, wasting their time. Own it. Be yourself. Show how your background is actually going to make you the best founder to build that business.
That is really sort of inspirational. Sort of thinking sort of practically then, like what are the sort of initiatives or changes you're trying to sort of personally invest in to try and tackle some of these problems when it comes to the sort of VC world and the startup world? Sort of what are the sort of practical things which can be done to try and make a change in these areas?
Yeah, I think people are doing this slowly. You're starting to see people sort of staying away from the warm intros. I know that's hard because it's something that has always been done. If your mate sends you a deal, you're more likely to pay attention. But I think making a conscious decision that if you say my inbox is open, that it's really open, and when those deals come in, that you actually give it as much weight as you would someone, that comes in through one of your pals. So I think just being very intentional about practicing what you preach, but also making it possible for the founders to get a sense of who you are as an investor, your thesis. You're finding loads of VC. I think the pandemic was great in that it allowed everyone to slow down and become a little bit more accessible. So you found people joining in on conversations on Twitter, people writing more Medium posts, and I've always said to founders, read those Medium posts and engage. That's how when I was looking for my role in VC, that's how I got to know quite a few investors. I'd read their content, reach out to them, have a conversation. They want to talk about the stuff they wrote. That's why they wrote it. So I think if you can find a way of connecting, there've been so many amazing virtual events, which have again been an opportunity to get to know the funds, get to know the partners, and understand how they think, and be in the same room with them and ask those questions. I organized a couple events with Charmaine Hayden, who's a partner at Good Soil, and Yvonne Bajella from Impact X, and it's called Female Founders Offline. And it was to really break down those barriers, giving founders the opportunity to be in the same space as investors maybe they ordinarily would never have come across. So we had Danny Reimer from Index, we had Antoine and Suzanne from Felix, Monique Woodard from Cake, and Mercedes Ben from Lightspeed. And it was so great just to be in a safe space where they knew that they could ask anything, down to I try to pitch my business on Afro hair and I didn't feel like anyone got it. How do I help you get it? And I think those conversations need to happen because they're awkward. You can't ask it in the pitch necessarily. So you want to know beforehand, how do I prep so that when I turn up ready?
That's really interesting. I was thinking before this, I was like, how many more sort of COVID related questions will I have to ask? And I was like, probably quite a few, but that's quite an interesting point about how it's maybe democratized in a sense, the interactions which people
Yeah.
can have.
Totally. I've had people slide in my DMs on Instagram, and that's okay. That is so okay. I'm
Mm,
fine with that. There's been some great WhatsApp groups. Obviously, there's Slack, and you're finding more investors and VCs being in the same space. And I think that is great because you get a sense of each other on a human level. I am all about that humanity. I'm not trying to be, some high and lofty person. I'm just June. And I think it's important that we see each other that way because I always describe it as a 10-year relationship. At the end of the day, you really want to get to know each other. With some of the founders we backed in the pandemic, and we're still in this pandemic, but last year and in the heat of it all, we got to know each other, very informally over WhatsApp, did the background checks, but it was just allowing each other to communicate in different ways that worked for them,
mm.
because we don't have that opportunity to meet them in person. So you're slowly getting snippets of their lives, you're allowing them into your spaces. I had them follow me on Instagram, I follow them. And because we're going to be spending so much time together, helping make that dream a reality. And it's so important, that human connection. I can't emphasize it enough.
That's interesting. I wanted to pick up on a theme of that I've heard you speak about before around failure, and I guess it ties into all we're talking about trying to get more underrepresented groups into these areas of business. What would you say have been your biggest failures or the things which haven't turned out right along the way, and how have you processed those?
Oh, that's a deep one. And yeah, I think having to stop Mums and Tech was hard. I couldn't make it into this massive scalable business that I had hoped. And it's a weird one because it was sort of finding the balance. And I think a lady called Adrian Hebert, which I think all your viewers should absolutely follow and listen to her Power Hour podcast and read her book. But she talks about, I think it's so important to know when to start something, when to let it go, and move on to the next thing. And I think I struggled with knowing when to stop. Mums and Tech was, something. I started as a passion project. I never
Mm,
intended it to be this money making machine. I started it because I wanted women to have access to this environment where they could learn about coding, to this community. It was never meant to make me loads of money because I didn't want to make it expensive. I could have, because that would have made the business work, but I wanted it to be accessible. I never wanted it to be at a price point that people couldn't attend on their mat leave, because we all know what people get on mat leaves, not much. So that was a very conscious thing. But then obviously the realities kick in. I needed to look after my family too. So I think it was knowing when it wasn't working for home. The business was taking me away from family for, a lot of hours. I was sort of on my laptop a lot because I was doing it all by myself. I had volunteers, but when it sort of is all hanging on you, you pour everything into it. And I really
mm,
wanted it to work. And I found myself just sort of working constantly, And they were like, "Oh, mommy's still on her laptop," and I'm like, "Oh, but I need this to work." So it's like it was like having another child, and it got to a point where it really was not working for the household anymore, and I had to figure out how to accept that Moms in Tech was going to have to stop, and it felt like a big failure. I felt like I was letting everyone down, but then I had to really weigh it up with, okay, but I've got a family and they need me. So, let's pause it for now and revisit. And then I took about a year to evaluate what I was going to do next. And that was hard because I kept thinking, oh, maybe I can give it one more shot, maybe one more shot. And I think a lot of founders do this when it's sort of dying and you want to try again, but actually you need to know when it's okay to say RIP and move on to something else. But I think what helped me was understanding my mission. Once I understood what I really wanted out of Mums in Tech, and it was to help female founders, to help increase the number of women in tech, that allowed me to sort of reframe my thinking and realize, okay, well, if I can't run that, how can I still be very actively involved in still achieving this mission? So I got on the board of Kijiko, which is all about mentoring girls and women into tech careers, connecting them with role models, and really demystifying that experience. And I think for me, that was an amazing journey, being a part of that, being on the board, helping them to grow. So it's sort of I de-risked by having a full-time job, working on venture debt, but also I could spend my spare time helping companies like Hajiko achieve their mission. And I recently got appointed to the board of Founders Ed, which is they're creating a free coding school. And again, it's amazing. So I think if you understand your values, you can still sort of find a way to do it in other ways. You don't have to be the founder necessarily. You can still do other things that still line up. And in the long run, you're still doing good.
Yeah, if you know in the long term what you're trying to achieve, any what you might perceive as a failure along the way, you can very easily reframe that for yourself as well. No, this was just a step on a longer journey. So, June, we're running out of time, so I've just got three final questions to ask you. The first one is, what did you used to believe that you no longer believe in?
It's an easy one. That I used to believe that I didn't deserve to have a seat at the table. And Lord knows I do.
I like that concise answer. That is perfect. Secondly, if this wasn't your mission, yeah, trying to get more women and people of color into technology and into those into those sort of leading positions in business, what would be?
Yeah, big one. And I think I would 100% be some sort of ambassador, maybe for Nigeria, because I grew up in Lagos, trying to, improve the image of Nigeria, or a campaigner for like human rights. I think I will always be some sort of advocate. I think that's in my DNA, but I would be advocating for equality.
I mean, amazing news this week watching the like inauguration and Kamala Harris and
Isn't
yeah
that awesome? Like the first time I can follow POTUS since Obama left. I
yeah
refuse to follow POTUS on Twitter.
back in now yeah.
I'm in.
Yeah, it must be a really sort of inspirational thing for people to see.
Absolutely. I mean, good wins in the end, which is so refreshing because I think we were all like, "Oh my God, there was a tiny chance like he might get back into power, and that would have just been awful to explain to my kids that the bad guys win." So
Yeah.
this is way better. It's like, okay, keep doing good. You want to be like Biden and Kamala.
And then finally, June, if you could recommend one book for members of the Journey Further book club to read, what would it be?
I think Mindset by Carol Dweck totally reframed the way I think about who I am. That growth mindset, I realize it's something that I work really hard at enhancing, because I know it's so important for me to realize that yes, things you could have slip ups, but believing that you have that power to change, you're not stuck, has been really powerful in helping me, constantly move forward, even when perhaps, in the trickiest of situations in the pandemic. I look back and I think having that mindset really allowed me to make lemonade out of lemons, as they say. Literally, so many opportunities. I saw them and I created them because I don't believe that I can't do anything. I mean, you saw my sign, believe it, achieve it. I literally do believe that I can do anything I set my mind to. And that book has played a massive role in that mindset.
No, thank you. I've not come across that, so I'm gonna look that
It's
up
powerful, powerful.
and we'll pass that on. June, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. I think that the mission that you're on is really inspiring, and I'm really excited to share it with lots of people when this comes out in a few weeks' time. So yeah, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.